Historians trying to summarise the development of the railways in the home counties, London, the south and southeast of England, need only write 3 letters: NSE. Launched in January 1982 as the London and South East business sector of British Rail, and taking on its most famous name in 1986, Network South East very quickly became a familiar and vital part of the landscape of the south and southeast of England, the home counties, London, and would go on to also become a very familiar name to railway enthusiasts. Today, the 10th of June 2026, marks 40 years since the creation of the Network South East brand. And in this short video, the first of 5 videos looking at Network South East and modelling Network South East, we're going to take a quick look at the development of Network South East and how it all happened. At the end of this video, there'll be links to other videos in the Clyde Station series, but in the description of below in this video, you'll be able to click on a couple of links to other things that may interest you with regards to Network South East. On the 5th of January 1982, the railways of Britain underwent what initially was a small but was a very fundamental change to the way that they were ran. Previously operated and managed on a regional basis, sectorisation changed the setup. Services were to be grouped by traffic type: high speed long distance services, commuter services in London and the South East, passenger services in the provincial areas of the country, parcels and freight. The regions, of which there were 6 of them, would still exist, but their role was now reduced to that of production services. Basically, they were paid by the business sectors to provide what the sectors asked them to provide, and the sectors bought in the drivers, track maintenance, and the sectors managed the stations. The regions therefore still existed, and the staff that still it worked for the regions on the 4th of January 1982 worked for the regions on the 5th of January 1982. The London and South East sectors only employees directly employed by them were a team of 30 at the sector's headquarters at London's Waterloo. David Kirby was the first sector director of the London and South East, and an early corporate livery was called the Jaffa Cake livery. It was basically 2-tone grey with an orange band through it, a bit like a Jaffa Cake biscuit. And this was applied to some Class 309 units on the Clacton Express service from London's Liverpool Street, as well as some Class 411 units and some motor luggage vans, the Class 419s. The story of the London and South East sector's development now switches to Scotland, where in 1984 Chris Green, the general manager for the Scottish area of Provincial, what would later become Regional Railways, adopted a new name for the Scottish area's local services, that of ScotRail, a name still used today. There was a new can-do attitude within ScotRail. Various things were getting done, stations tidied up, the brand name was getting put out everywhere, and as I say, there was a tremendous can-do attitude. So much so that when David Kirby was promoted to a new role at head office within the British Railways Board, it was of no surprise that Chris Green was promoted to become new sector director at the London and South East. And he immediately undertook a new plan called Operation Pride. There was going to be a new identity, but he said he did not want that identity launched until they had got the basics of standards correct and had a good idea of what assets they had, and to make sure that they could get the customer satisfied. Over the next few months there were some small improvements to stations, and there were also immediate plans for planned electrification and new services. Operation Pride culminated on the 9th of June 1986 at London's Liverpool Street, when 47573 appeared in this livery for its naming the London Standard, but with only the BR logo, not the branding. The following morning, in a ceremony at London's Waterloo station, guests were invited to the launch of the new identity. Those arriving were surprised and perhaps stunned or amazed to find the station had been cleaned up, new terrazzo floor tiles put down, shop fronts tidied up, the glass above the station roof cleaned, and then 2 trains arrived simultaneously. A Class 50 hauling some Mark II coaches and a Class 455 electric multiple unit, both in this new livery, and with it the new name, Network South East. This was a lot more than just a rebranding, because there was a complete emphasis on tidying up stations. More staff were getting employed to man telephones, man stations. There was even a new dedicated station cleaning team at various stations, and there was a complete change in signage at stations, with the signage having the Network South East flashes below it. Now they're not visible here, but you will see it in one of the links below. Signage also said, "Welcome to Network South East," or "Thank you for travelling Network South East." Under Network South East, there were immediate plans to upgrade rolling stock and bring in new trains. Class 321 units were employed out of London Liverpool Street on some commuter services, and also out of London Euston on Northampton line trains. The Class 442 Wessex Electrics were brought in for the electrification of the Bournemouth to Weymouth line. New units were also proposed for the Kent Coast service, although that coming just before privatisation, and these were called networkers. And diesel networkers were planned for and indeed delivered to the Chorlton lines, more about that in a minute, and also local services out of Paddington. There was a real can-do attitude within Network South East, and this was emphasised early on, just about a couple of weeks after its launch, when there was a network day where people could travel anywhere within Network South East for just £3. And Network South East laid on extra trains that day for this special day. Later network days involved people having to buy a special voucher or get a special voucher from Ian Allen magazines, or was only made available to network card holders. But whatever, Network South East was live. A particular emphasis was placed by Network South East on off-peak travel. It was realised that some extra units were sitting spare during the day, not being needed for off-peak travel. So Network South East made a special effort to emphasise to people to go out off-peak when fares were cheaper, and this was encouraged through a series of television adverts and also through special leaflets as well. It even emphasised going to the theatre at night and visiting the cinema at night, all part of the effort by Network South East to get people out onto the trains. NSE sponsored several events as well to keep the NSE brand going and keep it in the forefront of the public. One thing the rebranding did do was this eye-catching livery, nicknamed the toothpaste livery. In 1990, the BR logo was omitted from Network South East locos, trains and publicity, and the year before, 1989, the livery had been revised to a darker shade of blue on locos, and the stripes were not upswept at the end but just carried straight on. Network South East also was assisting with staff trying to organise depot open days. One of the most famous that ever happened was at Ilford in 1989, where about 14,000 people came through the doors to see what Ilford Depot had to offer that day. And by the way, that was on the day when the FA Cup final was on as well at Wembley. It was a hot day, so people could have made the way to the beaches at Southend, but they still got 14,000 people. And NSC was quite happy and supportive to all these sorts of events. There was a clear emphasis on the customer, and Network South East set certain standards at its stations, which in some cases we now just take for granted, like hanging baskets or flower tubs. There was also an emphasis on remembering that passengers need to get on further. So there was a London Connections map at every single station, regardless of whether it was small or medium or big or large. Network South East stations also had their lampposts painted red, and by golly, if you were a branch of B&Q selling red paint, I think you'd have been quids in 1986. The red lamppost was, as I say, probably one of the most famous parts of Network South East, but there was a clear corporate image and it was established very quickly. Coaching stock in blue and grey livery, and remember 99% of their stock was in blue and grey livery at launch, had the Network South East branding applied to it nevertheless. In 1989, NSC brought out route branding for groups of routes such as Kent Link, London Tilbury Southend, Harlequin Line, Northampton Line, to try and further emphasise the lines that operated, and to also further emphasise to staff that it was their line, so they could take great pride in what was being done and what was on offer to the staff and passengers. Staff videos were made, such as Train Care 90 with new standards on cleaning, and as I said, there was a clear emphasis on Network South East on extremely high standards, something that had never been seen before on the rail network, with the exception to a lesser extent on ScotRail. Network South East continued in this vein, and as I said already, there was a clear can-do attitude, and there was a determination with the support of local authorities to improve standards and improve high standards as well. One of the NSC's most successful projects was in 1986, not long after its launch, when a decision was made to withdraw the closure notices for the Chiltern Line services out of Marylebone. Now the plan was that services would be diverted to Paddington, and stations south of Aylesbury would have services going to Paddington or passengers would use the London Underground's Metropolitan line. However, it was realised just at the launch of NAC that the Metropolitan line would not be able to cope with such an increased demand, and the decision was made to withdraw the closure notices at Baker Street Station and Harrow on the Hill Station BR side. What instead happened was what was called total route modernisation. The diesel depot at Marylebone was reduced to a stabling facility, with a brand new depot for the network turbos being built at Aylesbury at the country end of the line, which probably made more sense because it meant that services were now finishing their day at the country end in the same way that the commuter flows would finish their day at the country end. Marylebone, as I say, was reduced to an overnight care and maintenance, not full maintenance, and also brand new signalling was introduced. Stations were fully upgraded, and the Chiltern line turbos were introduced, replacing the mixed formation Class 115s from the 1950s, which had units with maybe one or two cars in blue and grey, one or two cars in NSC livery. Since then, the Chiltern lines have undergone even further modernisation, and services go all the way up to Birmingham, and Aylesbury line services have been further extended to a new station beyond Aylesbury, completely emphasising the turnaround that in 40 years that have happened at the Chiltern lines. Now, the other piece of work that NSC done was actually only a very short piece of track compared to the Chiltern lines, but would be nonetheless very, very important indeed. And that was that the decision was made in early 1986 to reopen the Snow Hill Tunnel and the Blackfriars to Farringdon section. Passenger services had ceased on this section as long ago as 1915, but it wasn't until the late 50s that freight was finally stopped from going through onto the Widen lines as they were known, services only operating to Moorgate via King's Cross, Midland City. Under the new plans, the bedpan services, and it was Bedford to St Pancras, would be diverted back into the Snow Hill Tunnel, and thus not serving St Pancras, and then calling it the rebuilt King's Cross Midland City, which became King's Cross Thameslink. Services to Moorgate now only going peak hours, and trains then carrying on to Farringdon and then into a reopened Snow Hill Tunnel before climbing the steep bank next to Holborn Viaduct and into Blackfriars and heading south from Blackfriars to Wimbledon and Brighton. Further changes took place in 1989 and 1990 when the decision was made to close Holborn Viaduct, which was a peak hours only station by this time, demolish the station, dig up the part of the Snow Hill Tunnel, and then realign the tracks into a new alignment, which took the trains into a new City Thameslink station before climbing a new steep bank, all new alignment, and into Blackfriars. Today, City Thameslink station is an underground station with buildings above it, but what it's done is provide a much better service into the city, and it was Network South East that spearheaded this. Network South East continued until the 1st of April 1994, when it was broken up into various franchises ahead of rail privatisation. One thing, however, that did remain and still exists today from the Network South East legacy is the network card. This was launched in early 1986, not long after NSC's formation, when it was decided to launch a rail card that was for everybody, and it gave 1/3 off leisure travel anywhere in Network South East for a year upon payment of a small sum. The network card could also be used on regional railway services within the NSC area, but could not be used on intercity services in the NSC area. One important thing to mention about Network South East was that in April 1991, the British Railways Board decided to abolish the regions, and this meant that all production staff, that's drivers, track maintenance people, station staff, became employed by the sectors rather than the regions. This also meant that track would now be given a prime user and thus owner, and Network South East owned all the track within its area except the 4 main lines out of London: Paddington, Euston, St Pancras and King's Cross. On these, Intercity was the prime user and thus the owner, although Network South East could pay to access these tracks, and indeed Network South East owned stations on these lines. Network South East thus went from a business employing just 300 people to one employing 25,000 people, and it was actually the 15th biggest company in Britain at that time. Now, the Network South East legacy carries on because one station has actually been done up back into Network South East branding and signage. And it's also worth mentioning that Network South East is not forgotten because it gets modelled now, and modellers have a vast choice if they wish to model Network South East, and that will come later in the next programme when we'll look at modelling Network South East in general. Now, 40 years have passed since the formation of Network South East, and it tells you just how good a job it done that we're still talking about Network South East 32 years after it ceased to exist and 40 years after it was created. That tells you how good a job it done. Chris Green, the best chairman British Rail never had, was fundamental for this, and he really has been widely credited with his role, quite rightly, in the development of the railways in London and the South East. Well, that completes this story, a short story looking at the Network South East. As I say, there's a lot more to it, but it's far too much to go and fit into one video. But there are books about Network South East out there, and there's DVDs that look at Network South East trains that are out there and available, and I would urge you to do searches for those if you do want to learn a lot more about Network South East. The rest of the videos are all going to be about modelling. Now, later on this afternoon we'll have a general look at how you model Network South East, and then later in the month there'll be 3 videos looking at specific locations for you to model at Network South East, and in each case we'll try and do it with one looking at third rail, one looking at overhead, and one looking at pure diesel. So that's what's going to be coming up. Please stay tuned and watch out for those videos, and in the meantime, whatever you're doing, do take care of yourselves please, and enjoy your lives, and we'll see you soon, and happy birthday Network South East. Thanks for watching. Cheerio.